Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this special edition of Hidden History. We would like to welcome you along as we bring you stories from around the country and, of course, right here in Tampa Bay. They're stories of struggle, of heartache, and of hope. And we're going to begin tonight with a visit to a small town steeped in history, the oldest town incorporated by African Americans in our state. And it's celebrating more than 130 years of existence. About 6 miles north of Orlando, there sits a small piece of history.
And it's controlled absolutely by Afro-Americans.
The town of Eatonville, incorporated in 1887, the oldest African-American town in the United States.
At that time, the blacks and the whites were all together in Maitland. And then they just wanted to have something they could call their own.
It's named after Josiah C. Eaton, one of a small group of white landowners who were willing to sell their land to blacks at the time.
My father built the elementary school.
At 100 years old,
I thank the Lord I'm the only one still here.
Ella Dinkins is the oldest living resident of the quaint 1 square mile community of about 2,500 people. She remembers the town in her youth.
We only had dirt streets, no sidewalks, clay road.
Eatonville is one of the few surviving African-American settlements formed in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. The mayor credits that to God and
The tenacity and the perseverance of the people here.
the Eatonville Historic District was designated in 1998 and added to the National Historic Registry. It's comprised of 4 dozen buildings around the area, including this one. But it's the spirit of the people who call this place home that keeps the history and the heritage going.
Remember, this is where we came, and we can compare it from then and now.
Yes, ma'am.
I know I can.
And one of the things that Eatonville is known for is the Zora Neale Hurston Festival. She was from that area, a very prolific writer in the Harlem Renaissance era. Well, this year, organizers expect 40,000 visitors to come to that festival, and it is in its 30th year. 124 years ago, Florida saw a freeze so bad that it changed the way of life here in the state forever. And not just that, it profoundly impacted families in one area to the point of extinction. Tonight, the mystery of Freedtown, the town that vanished. Cars whizzed down Fort King Road in Pasco County, driving in the shadow of a sign of times past, showing a part of Pasco history that not many people know about. Down a dirt road a mile or so back, acres and acres with a story to tell.
And he had a little settlement there. They had a church and a school.
In 1866, this land just south of Lake Buddy was inhabited by freed slaves and appropriately named the Freedtown Settlement.
This is our drawer we have all our founding fathers in, and they had to be here before 1887 when we became a county.
There's a small amount of history kept here at the Pioneer Museum in Dade City, and as I looked through those documents, I learned a lot more about the 200-acre settlement. Like much of Florida at the time, the principal livelihood was orange crops.
People talked about orange fever in Florida. For just a few $100s, a yeoman farmer could come here, buy 10 acres, and put out orange trees and do quite well.
Former slave Benjamin Baisden was among them. He was the first to move there. In fact, he founded Freedtown. His citrus crops flourished. Reports show by 1880, his orange grove had, quote, borne him 3 crops within a year.
The unique aspect of Freedtown is that Benjamin Baisden went and did this on his own.
Freedtown had become paradise. By 1890, the Freedtown settlement had grown considerably. Several families called this land their home. There was a church, a school had been established. The people were absolutely thriving. And then, the unexpected.
December 27th, 1894,
The day Florida froze.
an Arctic clipper came and scoured Florida. I think it was 28 degrees in Tampa.
The orange industry suffered. These photos from the Florida State Archives show the frozen citrus littering the ground there throughout the Sunshine State.
It was bad enough to kill the crop, but not the trees. And then for 2 months, the weather warmed.
But it was only the beginning.
On February 7th, 1895, the Dakota Clipper arrived. This is a killer freeze. It was 22 degrees in Tampa, 10 degrees in Ocala. They were skating on ponds in Tallahassee.
And this time, the damage to citrus in Florida was far worse. Freetown, no exception. Crops there were killed off.
Overnight, as the Commissioner of Agriculture said, by morning's mist, most of the economy of Florida is gone.
Nearly everyone left Freetown. Some headed a couple of miles away to nearby Dade City. In fact, the AME Church in Freetown now relocated to Dade City. It's Mount Zion AME, and they still worship today. Benjamin Baisden, however, stayed on in the Freetown area, at least for another few years. But after his wife of 50 years died, he moved south to Tampa with his son Samuel.
We owned a whole lot. We owned a whole lot. Why we don't own it now, you know?
I found Samuel's grandson, Benjamin Baisden's great-grandson. He's also named Ben.
I'm getting chills just thinking about it all.
He is very proud of his ancestors' tenacity at a time when it was very difficult for African Americans to have it.
And I guess some of that stuff I believe is passed on to me because right now I'm kind of like a leader in the community, trying to do things for the community. We have this organization called the West Tampa Alliance. And I said to myself, how did I get this type of passion to want to help people? You know what I'm saying? I'm figuring out that it had to come from there.
Passion that has its roots in these rolling Pasco Hills, a settlement that's essentially vanished, but not the spirit of the people who started it. And there was a cemetery in the Freetown area as well, but that too no longer there. Research indicates it was actually destroyed in the 1950s during redevelopment of the area. Important to note, there are folks out there who believe this is all hogwash and that Freetown settlement actually never existed, or at least not in the place they say it did. Researchers, however, believe wholeheartedly that there was a Freetown, and relatives tell me they believe the story is passed on to them too. One more quick note, Benjamin Baisden now officially considered one of the founding fathers of Pasco County. Coming up next on Hidden History, a closer look at one of our country's greatest athletes. Where Jesse Owens' life began is coming up. Plus, we're going to show you a 400-year-old outpost that helped lead thousands of slaves to freedom. Virginia has one of the country's most sought-after seashores, but just off the beaten tourist path, you'll find historic Fort Monroe in Hampton. The former Army post played a major role in the Civil War, but as Don Roberts tells us tonight, it's also served as the gateway to freedom for thousands of enslaved African Americans.
The Ellis Island, New York, was the gateway to freedom for millions of European immigrants. They fled poverty and oppression for a chance to achieve the American dream. Well, one noted historian says there was another Ellis Island for African Americans.
In 1619, a ship with about 20 African captives comes into the Chesapeake Bay, lands at Fort Monroe, which was then called Fort Algernon.
Historian and author of the New York Times bestselling book 1861, The Civil War Awakening, Adam Goodhart.
So slavery, American slavery, began at that spot, but American freedom also began at that spot.
Goodhart says there were about 4 million enslaved people in the U.S. in 1861 when the Civil War broke out, and in May of that year, a pretty remarkable thing happened that opened the floodgates to freedom at Fort Monroe.
It really started with 3 very brave young men, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory, who were enslaved men in the Hampton Roads area. They had been conscripted, forced basically, into providing labor for the Confederate Army. They escaped, they took a rowboat, and they rowed across from Sewell's Point to Fort Monroe. And they came to the fort and presented themselves to the Union sentries and asked to be sheltered.
Shortly after Baker, Townsend, and Mallory made their way through those gates and were given asylum here at Fort Monroe, the word spread like wildfire, and within months, hundreds of escaped slaves made their way to the fort and were also given asylum. They were declared contraband of war. The word continued to spread, and shortly after that, thousands of escaped slaves found their way to Fort Monroe and settled in Greater Hampton. History professor Bill Wiggins says being declared contraband meant they were still considered property, and they were put to work for the Union Army in the fields wherever needed until emancipation in 1863.
We know that there were rapes that took place here, rations were very scarce. Individuals were taking advantage of. That's the other side of the story I want to focus upon. But it ultimately was freedom's fortress.
Pamela Holly of Portsmouth says her family traced her great-great-grandfather to the contraband camp at Fort Monroe.
His name is Robert Langley Brooks. He met his wife here, who attended the Butler School.
Ben Butler was a lawyer. He collected every single scrap of paper. So within this collection of papers are actually, for example, interviews, transcribed interviews of when Butler and his subordinates are interviewing people, enslaved individuals coming through the lines. These papers include names.
Names that historian Robert Kelly at Fort Monroe says could uncover hidden history. I'm Don Roberts reporting.
Coming up next on Hidden History, he was a slave who served a long time ago in an unlikely place, but his legacy lives on today. A man called Fortune next. And who could forget Jesse Owens, a return to the roots of one of the greatest athletes of all time. Stay with us. Lessons from the Grave, a man's life and death, providing a very personal look at a life lived by a slave in early America. Scott McDonald brings us the story of a man called Fortune.
In a Waterbury, Connecticut cemetery, a gravestone with a short but peculiar inscription. The man Fortune died 1798, buried September 13th, 2013. It's the kind of headstone that leaves every visitor wondering, what is the story behind this? It's the tale of a man owned as a slave and his bones.
Mr. Fortune, the skeleton that we were looking at, was owned by this surgeon in Waterbury. He was probably working on his land. He had a family with him. They were all owned as well by that family.
Right in front of anthropologists and students from Quinnipiac University, an unsettling truth. Slavery didn't just happen in the South, far from it.
I think a lot of people don't realize how prevalent slavery still was in the Northeast.
Studying the bones of Fortune,
he was extremely robust. He had very strong muscle markings.
Now provides rare insight into what life was like as a slave in New England.
I think this is the only example of a slave in New England that was examined. What was this individual's life like?
From the data collected,
your history is in the bones. So this is a cross-section of his life.
From lifestyle to diet.
But this feathering along the edge of the skull, and it could be due to nutritional deficiencies.
As it happens, the man who owned Fortune was Dr. Preserved Porter from Waterbury, a doctor.
A bone fixer.
And it seems Fortune was used in life and in death.
The story goes that after Fortune dies, Preserved Porter skeletonized him.
A skeleton used by the family to study osteology.
So the bones were passed down from generation to generation.
From generation to generation.
Ironically, in New England, the ground is so moist, if the bones remained buried, there'd be little left. But the disrespect of keeping Fortune's bones on display has now allowed the world to hear his story and give him the respect he deserves.
It is kind of a strange juxtaposition to know that, the very reason that he was used by the bone surgeon is also what ended up giving us some kind of evidence of what his life was like.
A ceremony held at the state capitol.
And that's why, again, we participated in the process of the burial, the funeral, which was amazing.
And Fortune's bones were put into a coffin. So after over 200 years, it's a proper grave. And through it all, forcing us to look at a disturbing past.
So that we know what kind of real consequences there are to some of these decisions and ways that we treat each other.
And hopefully, thanks to Fortune, learning an invaluable lesson.
Knowing your history means that you can kind of change your future.
For Hidden History, I'm Scott McDonald.
America's black streak, Jesse Owens, in the 100 meters.
More Hidden History is just ahead. A four-time Olympic gold medalist during 20th century era of white supremacy. Jesse Owens' modest roots coming up next. Plus, America's oldest baseball park holds a hidden history of its own. His accomplishments were monumental in the 20th century, and the impact the Alabama native had on the sporting world is still felt today, decades after his death. Jack Royer traveled to Lawrence County, Alabama, to the Jesse Owens Museum, where his legacy lives on in the very same spot where his remarkable life began.
He was born here. He picked cotton right here where we're standing.
This land looks a lot different than it did the last time Jesse Owens saw it himself. Long before the world-famous athlete heard a starter pistol, he spent 9 hard years living on this land in northwest Alabama.
Welcome to the Owens family home,
where a replica of his childhood home now reminds visitors that adversity never stopped Jesse Owens' will to win. The youngest of 10 children, many of them living together in a house like this, a replica on the family property.
They had a hard life here. Nothing come easy for him.
But winning would soon come easily for him after his family moved to Ohio, where his unheard of success at Ohio State University earned him a greater controversial opportunity.
By America's black streak Jesse Owens in the 100 meters. The world's most superb runner makes the others look as if they're walking.
In front of the world, Owens embarrassed Nazi Germany. Dedicated in 1996, the museum displays the history of Owens' life for all to see, attracting thousands of visitors every year, many not realizing he was born right here in Alabama.
People will argue with you about that, actually.
Jesse Owens would continue those impacts until his death in 1980. His birthplace perhaps hard to find, but it's also hard to forget, as the impact he had on the sporting world paved a way for today's athletes to succeed.
There's nothing else like it left. Everything else is gone by the wayside.
There are few historic baseball fields around the country, but the oldest park was actually built for a Negro League team. The hidden history of Rickwood Field is next. Welcome back to Hidden History. Spring training starts in just a few days, and fans will be pouring into baseball parks all across the country. But did you know that the nation's oldest professional ballpark is actually not in Boston, it's not in Chicago, but it's actually in Birmingham, Alabama? As Chris Wrinkle shows us, Rickwood Field holds a treasure trove of hidden history.
A monument to America's game that has stood the test of time.
There's nothing else like it left. Everything else is gone by the wayside.
Before the Gray Lady broke ground, where the Green Monster loomed over hitters and the vines climbed the walls of Wrigley, there was Rickwood Field.
Somehow or another, Rickwood Field has managed to survive.
In the early days of Birmingham's steel industry, industrial titan Rick Woodward built a state-of-the-art ballpark in the shadows of Birmingham's steel mills. Over a century later, Rickwood Field still stands, now America's oldest ballpark.
Was he baseball crazy, or was he a good businessman? And the answer is he was both.
In the early days of the sport, it was the home of Birmingham baseball.
You know, it's minor leagues have been here forever. I mean, this is the oldest ballpark in the country, and I was lucky enough to play here for 2 years.
The Barons saw future Major League stars pass through their gates on the way to the show, and it was the home of the Birmingham Black Barons, the juggernaut of Negro League baseball in the South.
There's a lot of local people who grew up here going to games with their dad and their granddad. And so they have an emotional attachment to the park.
Through its history, close to 200 Major League Hall of Famers have played a game at Rickwood Field. Names like Wagner, Cobb, Page, and even the Babe.
It's become a bucket list item for a lot of true baseball nationally.
That was Chris Wrinkle reporting in Birmingham for us. Well, we want to thank you for being with us tonight as we reveal some of the remarkable hidden histories across our country. We certainly hope that you enjoyed learning about the people and the places that contributed so much to create the cultural experience that we all share today. Have a good night.